Alejandro Calixto will be speaking with us about carpenter ants and IPM for carpenter ants. So go ahead, Alejandro.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Amar, and good afternoon, everyone. So this is what I'm going to talk about today is just a brief introduction about what are ants, how to identify carpenter ants, a little bit of biology and behavior, because that's really important for you when you develop an IPM program around these ants, and some tips about prevention and management. So what are ants? So ants are social insects. They live in colonies. They can be colonies that are really small, just a couple of dozen of individuals, or some colonies, they can have thousands of individuals. And they have a really unique and complex structure. So on your left, you can see the colony. That's the colony of Pogonomyrmex. It's a harvester ant, which we don't have in New York. But they have all these complex tunnels and chambers where they store the eggs, they store the food, and they protect the queen and other individuals in the colony. This picture here on the right is the colony of a fire ant, which we don't have in New York, but you can also see the external structure. You can see mounds that are being constructed from soil. They can make a nest in trees and other structures. And this is kind of a side view of a colony, a fire ant colony. So you can see all the chambers, you can see all the tunnels, and the different individuals doing their work inside the colony. Another important characteristics of ants, as I said, are social insects, is that they have different roles. It's called caste. That's what it means here. It's a caste. This is a carpenter ant. So they have different shapes and colors. And the colonies, all the ant colonies, the individuals, they have a very specific role in the colony. So in this particular case with carpenter ants, you have a queen. This is an alate queen. And at some point in their life, they detach those wings, they lose those wings. You have alates, males that they have wings, and you have the worker ants. So those are kind of the three major groups that you can find in the colony. And this is a quick snapshot about the life cycle of ants. So you have a queen, which is the reproductive the reproductive individual of the colony. And once the queen mates, it reproduces, it finds a place, and the first thing that she starts doing is laying a lot of eggs. Once those eggs, they hatch, they become larvae, then pupae. And one really interesting characteristic about ants is that a queen can lay eggs that they can produce reproductive individuals, either males or females, but also they can produce the workers, which are all females, and those workers, they cannot reproduce. That's a very unique characteristic in ants. So this is another picture just showing the different types of caste in a colony. This is worker and reproductives of leafcutter ants. This is from Texas. And you can see that they have a very specific role. This is a soldier, which is in charge of basically taking care of the other workers and the colony. And then you have different individuals. So some of them, they're the ones that are cutting the leaves. These small ones are actually in charge of protecting the worker ants that are collecting the leaves. And then you have the reproductive. So you have the queen, and as I mentioned, once they reproduce and they start establishing the nest, they lose their wings. And then you have the males that they always have wings, and the role is only for reproduction. It comes during one time in the year, and for carpenter ants would be the spring. You can see swarms of alates, and most of them are males that are looking for females for reproduction. So a little bit about the diversity of ants. So that's a really diverse group of organisms. There's about 12,000 species of ants in the world. We have about 1,000 in the US and about 80 species in New York. Something that is really interesting that I always mention in these presentations is the biomass, how much they weigh. So if you put all the animals that we have in the world in a scale, ants will represent between 15 and 20% of all that biomass. That's a lot of ants, right? Now, moving into how to ID carpenter ants, and my goal is not for you to become a really expert on IDing ants, but these are really a species that is really easy to identify. So there's three things that I always tell people to look at. One is the thorax. They have a rounded thorax. They have something that is called a node, and I'll show you another picture where you can see it a little bit better. And then you have these hairs, these thick hairs in the abdomen. And sometimes, depending from where you're looking at the ant, those hairs, they can look like yellow or gold color. They're also big. That's a big ant. So it's about half an inch. Depending on the species, you can get worker ants that it can be up to a half an inch. So this is a more detailed. It's a picture under the microscope, and you can see here the shape, the curved shape of the thorax. You can see the node, and you can see the hairs in the abdomen. So the most common species that we have in the Northeast are the black carpenter ant, which is the one that I showed you in the previous pictures. And actually, you can see that kind of golden coloration that is produced by the hairs. And we have the red carpenter ant. Those two species are very common in urban areas, but also you can find them in wooded areas as well. A little bit about the biology and behavior of these ants. One thing that I have to mention just up front is that carpenter ants, they don't eat wood. And that's something that I always tell people. And I remember when I was working in the South in Texas and Florida, people were saying, oh, my carpenter ants are chewing and destroying my house. In fact, they use the wood for making tunnels and to make the building nest, but they don't damage the wood. If there is damage that you think that is being produced by carpenter ants, if you see some dust that is being produced, it actually is an indication that you have a structural problem. So remember, these ants, they don't eat wood, but they use those materials, those wood materials that are in decomposition or they're wet, and they use that for building a nest. So you can find those colonies outside. They really like to live in trees that they have holes or they're weak and they're about to die. And you can see one indication that you have carpenter ants is you see this dust that is being produced. And that means that they're just making those tunnels and those chambers inside the tree. That's an indication that you might have carpenter ants. And this is just a section of that trunk, and you can see all the work they've been doing inside, just making the chambers and the tunnels. Now, in houses, in structures that are being built, again, as I said, these ants, they don't eat wood, but if they find wood that is rotten, is wet, is in decomposition, they will find that place and they'll use it for nesting. So that's why I always tell people that you have, particularly here in the Northeast, because of the weather in the winter, these ants, as well as other insects, they're looking for a place, a warmer place to survive. So these structures, they provide a nice habitat for them to build a nest. So you have to be really in alert, just inspecting your house and making sure that you don't have structures with this damage, because most likely you can get some carpenter ants building a nest in those structures. Remember, these ants, they don't eat wood. And basically, all that dust that you see, what you think is damaged, is just the wood that is being removed to create the galleries and the chambers to build the nest. So what do they eat? So carpenter ants, as many other ants, the worker ants are attracted to sugar, something that is sweet. So in the spring, if you have your plants outside, if you have, you're gonna see maybe some of these insects that are aphids. And aphids, they're sap-feeding insects. They feed on the liquids of the plant, and they produce a secretion. It's basically insect urine, and it's sweet. It's called a honeydew. And that really attracts the ants to that source of food. And what they do is they use that honeydew, they consume that honeydew, but they can protect those aphids. So they're very attracted to honeydew. But they can also prey on another insect. So that's a caterpillar here that is being carried by a carpenter ant, or they can be a scavenger. So I've seen a lot of carpenter ants around where I live, where you see some dead crickets, and they like to get that as well. So remember, so you have the sugar, which is the source of carbohydrate, and then you have all these insects, live or dead, that are the source of protein. And then inside your house, so this is a nice muffin or pie, and you can see they're really attracted to this here. That is, of course, it's got sugar, it's sweet. So you can see recruitment, all these ants being recruited to that source of food. Inside the houses, if you have pets, they like cat food, they like dog food. If you leave sugar on the counter, they're gonna go for that sugar. If you have candies, your kids are leaving candies on a counter, and if you have colonies close to your house and they're getting inside the house, they will be attracted to that. So some recommendations, how do you know if you have an infestation? So one is, as I mentioned, and that's what I was explaining, the different casts the ants have, is during the spring, they have what is called the nuptial flights. So all these reproductives, the virgin queens and the virgin males, they leave the colony and they fly. They want to find a mate, and sometimes they are attracted to light. So if you live in an urban area, you don't live in a wooded area, and you start seeing a lot of these alates, reproductive alates, most likely you're going to have a colony that is nearby the house. Another indication that you have a carpenter ants nearby your house is, of course, if you see these worker ants getting in your house. They can have colonies that are sitting in a tree, but they also can have what is called satellite colonies. So you have the big colony where you have the queen and the brood and the larvae, but they can also build smaller colonies close to the house. That is a really nice strategy. Many ant species exhibit that. So, but if you see ants in your kitchen, on your counter, getting on your food, you have a carpenter ant colony close to your house. And of course, if you have any damage, you're gonna see the dust, all the wood that is being removed when they're building those chambers, like I showed you when they're nesting on those trees. And that is an indication that you have a serious problem in your house. And I remember in Florida, well, of course, Florida, because you have a lot of weather and it's rainy and it's humid, but there's some old houses that they have collapsed because carpenter ants, they start building the nest in those structures, in those 4x4, and those structures collapse. So it is really important just to keep an eye on that dust, because it's probably an indication that you have carpenter ants using the structures in your house. This is just a picture. This is just one 4x4, and if, as you probably know, all this wood for construction is treated. But sometimes when they treat that wood, there are some areas that they don't receive all the chemical to protect the wood. And this is just a perfect example. So this is an area that probably didn't get all the protection when it was being treated. Most likely this 4x4 was sitting on the ground, and then that attracted the ants and they built this beautiful nest. So how do you prevent and manage carpenter ants? So of course, we in IPM, we focus on prevention. So some ways to prevent getting carpenter ants coming into your house is you have to eliminate the source of the wood that is being provided for them to construct the colony. So if you have wood that is in contact with the ground, but also is really close to your house, it's better to remove that wood and put it away from your house. Also, all that wood that we use for the winter, if you're using it for your chimney, it's better to have it really covered, protected from the rain and the snow, and keep it a distance from your house. And another thing is, if you have trees close to your house, and if the branches are touching the roof of your house, they can get into the roof. And if you have damage in the roof, and I've seen in the south damage where you have the gutters, water is going behind the gutter, they like that area. They can build a colony between the gutter and the wood where the gutter is attached to the house. So if you cannot prevent, if you have a serious problems of carpenter ants, the first thing that you have to do is you have to find a colony. Luckily, this is a big ant. You can see the trails. So if you have some issues with these carpenter ants trying to locate the colony, just follow the trail. As I mentioned, they're social insects. They communicate. They use chemical cues, so they mark those trails. So most likely, if they're coming in your house, they're looking for food, they're marking the trail, and then you can follow the trail. It's a little bit of doing some kind of a wildlife biology work. Just follow that trail and locate the colony. Once you locate the colony, you have the option of using a contact insecticide. And you have to be really careful. So if you get an insecticide from Home Depot or Lowe's, make sure you read the label, follow the instructions, because not only you have the risk that is being produced by the ant, but also you're putting yourself at risk if you are not handling those chemicals properly. So the key for if you find a nest and to kill that colony, if you're using a spray or a contact insecticide, is you have to spray the colony. If you try to spray the trails, you're going to kill the worker ants, but you're not going to kill the colony. And you have to think the colony is just an individual. So you have the queen, you have the workers, you have the reproductives. So you have actually to target the individual colony. So I remember having a lot of people complaining, hey, I've been trying to control ants in my house. I spray and I kill those ants, and then a few days later, they're back. I said, well, it's simply because you're killing the workers. The queen is still laying eggs, producing a worker brood, and is sending workers again to find some food. If those contact insecticides, they're not effective, when you are applying them directly to the nest, or you cannot find the nest, the next step is using what is called a toxic bait. There's some baits that they sell in stores, and they're relatively safe. The same thing, you have to make sure you read the label. If you're going to use those baits, make sure that you don't put it close. If you have pets, make sure that you don't put it close to where they spend the time, that they don't have access to those bait stations, because that's food. Bait stations, they're food. It has an attractant, and it has the active ingredient that is actually what kills the ant. Another tip, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this. Of course, another side of the prevention is you have to make sure that you find those holes. If you're following a colony or the trail, if you find those holes in the wall or they're coming under the door, that's the first thing you have to do. You have to try to make sure that your house is bulletproof, pest proof. And the only way to do that is finding all those holes. And I know with ants it's more difficult because it's a small insect. But if you follow the trail, most likely you're gonna find the hole, and then you're able to seal that hole. And you're gonna see the difference. They're not gonna be able to get inside your house. Also, you have to maintain, just clean the area where you have food. I got my daughter here. She just opens a bag of potato chips, and there's crumbles everywhere. I mean, that's a banquet. That's a buffet for these ants. So if you have a colony of carpenter ants outside your house, most likely they're gonna come every day and look for that food. And I know this is hard, but it's really important to keep food stored in containers. So if you have pets, we have dogs here, we try to keep the pet food in containers sealed. So at least we know the ants are not going to be able to get into those containers. Again, so when you're inside, of course, the insecticides that you spray is an option. We don't recommend using a spray or contact insecticides inside your house. I tell the people avoid using those products because you are in an enclosed environment. You're spraying a chemical. You have children. You have pets. And then you have to read the label. You have to wear gloves. So it gets more tricky. Again, if you focus on prevention, on all those, follow those tips that we're providing here today, you might be able to reduce the incidence of those ants inside your house, or basically eliminate the problem as well. If you still have some problems, you still have some ants, as I mentioned, the alternative of using toxic baits is a good one. They have low toxicity. They come in some containers, so they have some sort of protection, and they're using the behavior and ecology of the ant to kill the ants. So they're basically recruiting the ants. The ants are attracted to the bait, so they can have some compound that has sugar, and there's some baits that they look like peanut butter. And as I said, you know, they like carbohydrates and they like protein. So they're going to be constantly looking for those type of source of food inside your house. So when you have those toxic baits stations, that's food, and they detect that as a food. They collect the food with the active ingredient or the insecticide. The ants will mark that area. As I said, they have those really complex communication cues using chemicals. So more ants are coming back, and they're going to continue collecting the food with the insecticide. And then they bring the bait, the bait with insecticide back to the colony, and they have this behavior that they pass their food to another. So, and then they bring it back to the colony. Once that the ants, they bring that to the colony, they feed the other individuals in the colony. They feed the larvae, and they feed the queen. So that's a really effective way as well to control ants. If you have been unable to prevent the ants coming in your house and they're becoming a problem, a nuisance, these toxic baits are very effective. They're very safe. And the key is for the ants to take that active back to the queen and the brood. Now, there's different types of toxic baits. There's some toxic baits that they're high on sugar. There's some other toxic baits that are high on protein. You have to observe, you have to do some work as well, because sometimes depending on the requirement of the colony, perhaps they're not interested in carbohydrates when you're putting, for instance, this bait station, the Terra bait stations, which they have sugar. And that's very common. So I've heard people complaining, oh, those bait stations, they don't work. And I said, are they just, if you're putting that bait station, are they eating? Are they getting the product? And they said, well, they're not interested in that product. And then I said, well, try the other one. Try the one that has the one that looks like peanut butter. And then they were very effective at getting the product and bringing it back to the colony. Most of those baits, they have, the most common active ingredients are ivermectin, borax, fipronil, and spinosad. Some, they kill the colony and the workers really fast. Some other, they take some time. So even after you are baiting inside your house, it might take a few days or even weeks until you see a suppression or control of the colony outside your house. So again, the success of using those baits is put those stations where you think there's a high activity of ants. So if you see a trail, that's a good place to place the bait station. Make sure you observe those stations at least for 24 hours. You don't have to be 24 hours in front of the bait station. Well, you can, but it's important for you to make sure that they're collecting the toxic bait. If the bait is ignored, you have opened that bait and they're ignored, they're not getting that bait, you have to substitute, you have to try another one, and you have to get rid of that one, because that is food, it goes bad, and the active, it won't longer work. So some take-home messages. Of course, the first thing, focusing on prevention outside your house. If you have wood or structures that are damaged close to your house, make sure you remove those. They're basically, they will attract these ants and they will build a nest in those structures. Just get everything that is in contact to your house that is wood. It's probably a good idea to move that away from your house. Remove all the dead trees or fallen trees that are close to your house. Make sure if you have big trees and they're in contact with the roof, just to make sure you remove those branches. I've seen that was very common when I was living in the South. A lot of damage in the roof, and there's some areas that you don't see. So and then you can have a more serious problem. Pieces of your roof can collapse because the ants are just removing all that dead wood for building the colony. In your house or around your house, just look at those areas where you think the ants are getting inside the house. So all those holes, make sure you seal those. Keep your kitchen clean, which of course I preach that, but of course I get my daughter, as I said, and they open all the candies and they have the buffet for all these ants. And just try to avoid using contact insecticides. If you want to control the ants inside your house, make sure use toxic baits. Those are the best way to control them if you use them accordingly. And of course, remember to always read the label on those insecticides. That's a chemical, is toxic. So make sure you follow instructions if you're using an insecticide. We have in our website a lot of information about carpenter ants, so I encourage you to visit our website. There's a QR code. If you have your cell phone, feel free to scan the QR code, and it's going to take you to a website where we have more information about carpenter ants. This is another app that when I do presentations about ants and identification, is called Seek. If you have a Google Android or an iPhone, you can download that app. And it's really good for IDing large insects. So I've used it on carpenter ants. I've done demonstrations because it's really important for you to ID and make sure that it's a carpenter ant, because if you're going to follow all these recommendations against another ant species, you might not have the same results. So identification is really important, and this is a really good tool for you guys to use and have it in your cell phone. It's free. The QR code is here as well if you want to get into the website and get more information about that app. And with that, thank you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Alejandro, thank you so much. We really appreciate your great information that you shared with us. I neglected to let everyone know. So Dr. Alejandro Calixto is the director of the New York State IPM program. And he has a special appreciation and admiration for ants, which is why we wanted him to come chat with us today about carpenter ants and carpenter ant IPM. Our IPM Minute, which is going to be on carpenter bees. So Dr. Margarita Lopez Oribe is joining us. She's an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Entomology at Penn State University. She is a bee expert, and she'll be sharing some practical tips for carpenter bee IPM.
Thank you, Mara. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margarita Lopez Uribe, and I am in the Department of Entomology at Penn State. And today I am going to talk a little bit about carpenter bee biology and some of the things that we can do to implement IPM practices if they become a problem in structures. Okay, so here I am showing you a photo of the most common carpenter bee in Eastern North America. And I would like you to notice a few things about the morphology of these bee, right? They're very large. We all know that. They have a very round head, a very hairy thorax, which is the segment where we see the wings and the legs coming from. And then, but you can also see that the abdomen, the last segment of the body, it doesn't really have a lot of hair, right? It's very shiny and barely has any hair. But even though that's the most common species, there is great diversity of carpenter bees. And actually, there are hundreds of species worldwide. And in North America, we have both large carpenter bees, like the one that we are seeing here to the left. And we also have a small carpenter bees, which is what you guys are looking here to the right of this slide. So both of these bees are carpenter bees. They are phylogenetically related, right? Like they share a common ancestor not that long ago, and they share a lot of the same traits from a biological perspective. So both of them use wood. Both of them can become social depending on the environment, even though the size, looks very, very different. Another interesting fact about carpenter bees, so that, it's not only about the problems that they cause, but they're actually really cool bees. They are the largest bees in North America. And so here, I love this photo. It shows the head of a carpenter bee. And on top, we can see the smallest bee in North America, which is called Perdita minima. And we can see that that small bee is only the size of the tip of one of the eyes of large carpenter bees. Okay, so those were the fun facts about carpenter bees, but for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the eastern carpenter bee. The scientific name is Psilocopa virginica. And both in New York and in Pennsylvania, this is the only carpenter bee. In Pennsylvania, in the south, we're getting reports of a new species coming from the south of the US, but this is the only carpenter bee that you will see in northern latitudes. And again, you can see here the shape of the head, the hairy thorax, the shiny abdomen, and this is a female, so you can also see pollen grains attached to the legs, which is where they have these really long hairs to keep the pollen that comes back to the nest. Carpenter bees can be sometimes confused with bumblebees because bumblebees are also really big, hairy bees. But I would like you to pay attention to a few things about the morphology of bumblebees that may help us separate them, right? So bumblebees, you don't see these in this photo, but bumblebees have a very elongated face instead of a round face like carpenter bees. And if we look at the distribution of the hairs in the body, we see that bumblebees have a very hairy abdomen. And they don't have a lot of hairs on the legs, which is the opposite pattern that we see in carpenter bees. Carpenter bees have a bare abdomen and really hairy legs. So these are just some of the tips that you can use if you see a big bee flying outside. This can help you determine which type of bee it is. Okay. But why are carpenter bees a problem? Why are we talking about IPM and carpenter bees? Well, carpenter bees build their nests in wood, and they do that by chewing wood to build tunnels that they will use to build their nest. Okay, so basically here we can see this is a carpenter bee opening, chewing the wood for the entrance of a nest. And here we can see what they do inside the nest. So as they start building or chewing the wood, they produce a lot of like sawdust, and that's what they use to separate these different compartments inside the nest. So if we go and we look at what is happening inside the nest, this is what you see, right? You see that inside the wood, they have these cells, which are these compartments that the bees are using to put the pollen and nectar and lay the eggs. And then those eggs become larvae, which is what you're seeing here in these two photos. Eventually they pupate, and then new adults will emerge. So all of this happens inside the nest. The problem is that the chewing of wood to make these tunnels for the nests of carpenter bees weakens the wood if they are part of human-made structures. And so in this way, carpenter bees, if they start using the wood of our houses or benches or wood tables outside, over time they can weaken the structures, and then this can become a problem. Now, this problem can be exacerbated when we have birds actually as part of the system. So this is very typical. This is very typical of what we see when woodpeckers actually detect or they find these carpenter bee nests. They basically open holes in the wood to eat the larvae and pupae inside the nest of the carpenter bees. And so it weakens the wood even more, and actually it looks really ugly, right? If we don't have the birds in the system, we actually don't see the tunnels from the outside, even though they are there. So having these bird predation definitely makes the problem worse. Okay, so what can we do to control carpenter bees using an IPM approach? So the first and most important thing is to really prevent their establishment, right? They are not a problem unless they establish in wood structures. So there are easy things that we can do to prevent their establishment, like, for example, painting wood, right? So carpenter bees like soft, natural wood, and if the wood is painted, oftentimes that makes the wood less attractive. If there is no opportunity to paint the wood, you can use oil, so almond oil or citric oils that also make the wood less attractive. So if you prevent their establishment, most likely you're not going to have problems with them. However, if they become established, then the next step would be to replace the piece of wood that they are using to prevent an infestation, right? So if you control the carpenter bee nests at the very early stages of establishment, the repair may be simple. However, this may not be possible every time. And if the problems increase and there's an infestation, there may be a need for treatment with insecticides. And so these insecticides are applied usually in a powder form inside the nest. But it is important to keep in mind that you need to contact someone that has a pesticide license to apply these treatments. So these are kind of like the three different steps or recommendations for how to deal with carpenter bees in your house. Carpenter bees are also, we can also see them, visiting flowers. So this is a carpenter bee visiting actually robbing nectar from a blueberry flower. But yeah, this is my contact information, and Amara, I don't know if I have time for questions, but I would be happy to answer any questions if anyone in the audience has some. Thank you.
We have already run over time. I've been keeping an eye on questions in the chat. I will collect those and we'll make sure that we get answers to questions after the meeting. And thank you everyone for being here today.